have brought 30 people here from across the country this week to advocate on the Hill. A couple of you here were we lobbied or advocated with today on broad issues that we're going to talk about today, issues that are on in the Latino climate justice framework that you'll see, issues that we work with on climate and clean air, issues on public lands and ocean, issues on sustainable communities, clean transportation, and issues that on clean water equity, issues that affect the Latino community so dearly that we think are so important. And so we're very glad you're here. I want to thank Unidos US and their fearless leader, Janet Murguia, our good friend, for welcoming us to this wonderful space. Isn't this a great space? It's just great. We love it. So come back tomorrow at 10 a.m. for the next event. I also want to acknowledge that we're all currently on stolen land from the Anacostan and Piscataway tribes. And it's not just enough there to stay there, say their name. We must work together to make sure their land is returned. So that's very important. It's also not right to stand by when members of our own community are spreading racist and disdainful messages. To the members of the Los Angeles City Council, and I just heard on the way over here that Nuri Martinez resigned, for not just from the chair, but also for her position. But those who participate in the harmful activity, you cannot hold elected positions of trust while holding such a hurtful and demeaning view of the people that you have represented. It's time to go. It's time to step down, do the work to repair the harm you've caused in the community, and the internal work to understand what you have done and why you did it, so that doesn't happen again. We'll be here to support you doing that work, but you have to step down first. So let's make sure that that continues to happen and keep our voice up. It shouldn't happen to any of our communities, and it's very sad that it did. But the voices that are being heard in Los Angeles and around the world, and I have many friends who positioned themselves in LA by the city council and city hall, really have shown that our voice counts. And it's significant what we can do together as a community. And so let's remember that. We have the power. We have the power together to do that in community. So today is an exciting and long-awaited day. 1 year ago, October 15, 2021 to be exact, 22 national and local Latino organizations came together to start a long journey toward creating a climate justice framework that addresses the climate crisis while focusing on and addressing the disproportionate environment and climate impacts and distinct needs of the Latino community. This evening, we are thrilled to launch the Latino Climate Justice Framework, the LCJF, and which is the first national climate policy agenda created for and by the Latino community. Let's hear it for that. The release of this framework comes at an inflection point in climate politics. The passage of the bipartisan infrastructure bill, the movement of Justice 40 in the administration, and the recent passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, the IRA. These policies have brought promise to address the climate crisis while, unfortunately, also underscoring even more the need for a clear policy framework built by our voices for our gente that highlights the steps necessary to address the unique inequities and injustices that nuestra comunidades face across the country. The our work's not done. These are just some bills, and they had positive stuff, but they had many negative things that we have to continue to fight and stop. We can't allow drilling on our public lands. We can't allow drilling in our oceans. We can't allow this to happen in our communities. The LCJF framework presented today builds upon the significant work that frontline climate and environmental justice leaders working in communities across this country have done for decades to highlight and remedy the disproportionate environmental, economic, and health harms that their communities face each and every day. We wouldn't be able to stand here if we weren't standing on the shoulders of the leaders like Juan and Ana Paras in the back here, who we're giving an award to on Thursday. I want to recognize them. If you guys would stand up for a second, please. Juan and Ana Paras are from Texas. We love you and we appreciate you. Our work stands on your shoulders, so thank you for being there. We build upon this work by analyzing and highlighting the disproportionate impacts that the climate crisis is having on our communities. We don't just highlight the issues, we also propose solutions. This framework will go far toward ensuring that from now on, our priority issues are elevated, they're protected, and they're included in all future climate crisis proposals. Our objective with LCJF is to influence and galvanize climate action at every level of government, with a comprehensive, accessible, easy to follow tool that Latino serving groups and allies can use to advocate for Latino community priorities. As billions of dollars in much needed federal funding goes out to states and localities designated for our communities, we must influence and galvanize federal, state, and local efforts together. While this framework isn't exhaustive, it does cover current core climate issues impacting our communities. Everything from dramatically improving our transportation and electric grid, to cleaning up thousands of abandoned oil wells, posing risks to our communities, to boosting community resilience and increasing equitable access to nature's benefits. We can no longer afford to address the climate crisis without addressing comprehensive immigration reform, climate migration, and increased language and immigrant access to services and resources. We have seen what weather disasters strengthened by the climate has done to our communities in Puerto Rico, in Florida, in Houston, in California, across the country. It is happening where we live, and we're the ones suffering for it. Even in Bowling Green, Kentucky, where a tornado destroyed the home of our colleague, Francisco, right here, whose family is still 9 months later homeless, has not received services or benefits, while the state spends emergency money on trolleys. We can't have this for our community, and his story is one of hundreds of thousands of stories that we see across the country of our communities not being provided services, being excluded because of our immigration status or language issues, and that can't happen. So we know the importance of why we're here today. We know the importance of having a framework in everyone's hand to be able to advocate together, to be able to, in every level, when your city, when your state, when your county says that we're going to do something to address the climate crisis, your questions are, what are you going to do about immigrant access? What are you going to do about language access? What are you going to do about the climate crisis for our particular issues? And everyone will have that in their hands. This is not the end of the process. This is the beginning of the process. We will continue to grow this document, add other items that we want to help service the community as the needs increase, but to be able to be there to help advocate together with our voices. So please let us know what you see in there that you like, what you don't like, what needs to be added. This is just the first edition of many editions of the Latino Climate Justice Framework that we need to make sure that we build upon. So thanks again for being here tonight. I am now honored to welcome a leader who worked at the Clinton White House, served in the city council, and as mayor of Hermosa Beach, California, where she was a strong advocate for environmental justice, standing up to a powerful oil company and stopping a proposed project to drill dozens of oil and injection wells in Hermosa Beach and the Santa Monica Bay. Now in her third term, representing California's 44th district, she is the vice chair of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus and a member of the Progressive Caucus. She chairs the Border Security, Facilitation and Operations Subcommittee of the Homeland Security Committee. And she just became, in 2019, she became the first Latina in 10 years to hold a seat on the prestigious House and Energy Commerce Committee. Representative Nanette Diaz-Barragan serves as a voice for the communities that have been on the front lines of the negative health impacts associated with climate change and environmental injustice. From fighting for comprehensive and affordable health care for all to ensuring clean air and clean water for her communities, she works tirelessly for her fellow Americans and the constituents of her district. Please join me and turn your attention to the screen for a welcome message from Representative Nanette Diaz-Barragan. Let's hear it for her. She's a great champion for our community and has been for a long, long time. So we're going to continue on with the LCJF Forum with an outstanding lineup of speakers and panelists that will discuss how Latino, Latina communities are uniquely impacted by the climate crisis and what we can do together to garner meaningful climate and environmental justice action at the local, state, and federal stage. To moderate this discussion, I'm proud to introduce Green Latino's Climate Justice and Clean Air Program Director and the main driving force behind this report, the unstoppable Irene Berga. Irene.
Can you hear me? Yes. Hi, hello everyone. Thank you, Mark. So I have the incredible privilege and honor to introduce just amazing lineup of speakers this evening. And I just want to kind of reemphasize a lot of the points that Mark brought up with LCJF. This has been an incredible effort from our comunidad over the last year plus time, really bringing together the ideas of each and every one of us to help form the concepts of LCJF. And as he pointed out, we're excited. This isn't a final process. We see this as a living, breathing document and one that we can use to empower ourselves and our communities, and that we can, create and iterate over time. So with that, I want to introduce some speakers that are doing incredible work on their own, covering a range of topics that the LCJF covers. First, to bring up is going to be Laura Esquivel. She's the Vice President for Federal Policy and Advocacy at Hispanic Federation. Laura. Next, we're going to bring up Mayra Reiter, Project Director for Occupational Safety and Health at Farm Workers Justice. Mayra. And then joining us via Zoom, we have Elizabeth Jean-Pierre. She's the Executive Director of UpRose. And I think we're pulling that up right now. Ah, I see her. Hi, Elizabeth. Yes, give her a round of applause. Can you hear us okay, Elizabeth?
I can hear you, yes.
Oh, okay, we can hear you. Awesome. Okay, good. And just as a quick reminder, as you hear our speakers today, please make note of any questions you may have for our panelists, and we'll leave some time for Q&A at the end. So to get us kicked off, I wanted to start with a question for Mayra. So as you know, the Latino Climate Justice Framework touches on a range of topics, including around farm worker justice, the central work that your organization and that you lead on. We know that over the summer, the US had a record-breaking heat waves across the country, and the Latino community, especially, in several Central or Latin American countries like Central America, are heavily represented in outdoor professions such as farm working. And temperatures are only expected to rise. So can you speak more to day-to-day reality of this issue and some of the policy solutions you feel can have the most positive impact, and why you think it's important to include farm worker justice in a plan like the Latino Climate Justice Framework.
Yes, thank you, Irene, and good evening, everyone. The reality for the 2.4 million farm workers who labor in fields in the country is that they are risking their lives to plant the crops and harvest the food that we eat. And we are seeing that heat waves are becoming a common occurrence, and it has been getting worse for the last few decades. And still, in most of the country, farm workers don't have nearly enough protections. The federal government requires that water be provided in the fields. This doesn't always happen. In most states in the country, they are not required to have regular rest breaks when the temperatures are extreme. They are not, employers are not required to give them shade to protect themselves when the temperatures get too hot. And this is the reason that farm workers have a rate of death from heat-related illness that is 35 times higher than the rest of private industry in the country. So what we would like to see is for the Occupational Safety and Health Administration to issue a federal heat standard that ensures that workers have rest, that they have shade, and that they have water in the fields, as well as training on how to prevent and respond to heat-related illnesses. We want to make sure that they also have a good enforcement mechanism for this rule, so that we can make sure that the rule is followed. The same needs to be done with pesticide regulation. The same needs to be done with all the other workplace rules that are there to protect farm workers, because we have a lot of rules in the books. We don't have enough enforcement.
Agree with that. Thank you. I want to turn it over now to Elizabeth. And just to touch on the topic specifically of community leadership and co-governance. The Latino Climate Justice Framework covers the problems around equitable pathways to access and meaningful engagement through barriers such as language access. How can we create a truly equitable system of co-governance with community that fosters community leadership and meaningful engagement and representation in processes that foundationally shapes policy?
Well, first, let me say Ashe, and thank you so much for inviting me. And I want to congratulate the Barras family for their long history of just being a bunch of badasses in this work and never giving up. I had the opportunity to be in Houston with them and remember how difficult it was for me to even breathe when I was in the area that their office is located. That's how serious it is. So just really in gratitude to be in community with you all. Well, you know, here's the thing. The thing is that we know that climate change is going to disrupt social cohesion. It lands literally at this intersection of all of the isms and exacerbates a long history of extraction and toxic exposure. And so we know that because it's unpredictable, that we need to strengthen grassroots organizing and base building, and we need to make sure that the front line leads. And what that means is that we can no longer accept top-down tops created solutions. It literally, all these solutions, including the agenda that we are launching today, comes from the ground, from the people that are most impacted. And from my perspective, what co-governance means is, you know, we've had in recent years an emergence of Latino elected officials who come into this work because they care about housing, they care about immigration, they care about social services, but they know very little sometimes about, with the exception of a few, obviously, about energy, about food sovereignty, about how to ensure wellness, about how to make sure that we have a grid where we create community wealth and we are investing in community-owned solar cooperatives and making sure that we are operationalizing a just transition on the ground. And so what they often are exposed to are lobbyists who come to them and literally helicopter in with a lot of resources and a lot of and overwhelm them. They are people who look like us, without us ever having taken the time to provide them with the frameworks, with an education, with a grounding on the issues that are important for them and for us, and how they can use their office to be able to amplify and move an agenda that is coming from people on the ground. And that's what I consider co-governance, the fact that climate change is going to disrupt governance as we know it, and that we need to be leaderful and we need to work in a way where there is deep accountability to the communities that they represent, and that they're taking their marching orders from the people most impacted, that they see us as partners in decision making, and not just sort of people whose expectations have to be managed. We know that elected officials almost always change immediately, months into having been elected, after the first ribbon cutting has happened. And so we want to make sure that these folks that have access to governance now, because of the legacy of work or organizing and struggle, that have benefited literally from the civil rights movement, that they're accountable to us, but that we're also in partnership, that we're at the table with them, making sure that we're addressing the complexity of how climate change shows up in our lives, either in our health, in our lack of wealth, and in our ability to thrive. And that requires that we work as partners in a way that we haven't done so. Right now, what happens is that we go to DC and we share our agenda and we push for elected officials to push agendas that serve our communities. And I'm saying that locally, on a hyper local level, whether it's the city council, the assembly, the Senate, or even at the federal level, that their marching orders literally have to come from our communities, and that we should be considered their brain trusts and partners in decision making. It's different. It's a different way of thinking, but imagine what happens if disruption makes it impossible for us to be able to have the kind of governance that will make us strategic and impactful when extreme weather events start advancing in our communities. And that only comes from organizing and from frontline leadership. It's the same thing that we're asking organizations to do, to share resources, to work strategically, not to supplant each other. When Mark opened, he started by talking about how this initiative is literally built on the work and the legacy of the EJCJ leaders who've been holding it down for so long. Governance should be like that too. We need to be able to work with each other in a way that is fundamentally different than the way that we've been conditioned to, which is really sort of extractive and competitive and top down and exclusive. We need to think differently about what governance looks like in the face of climate change.
Yes. Gracias, Elizabeth. And I like what you said about disrupting the system, because we're already living in a disruptive climate. And whether we like it or not, a new order needs to happen. And I also want to uplift kind of nurturing leaders from a young age, and bringing that to the forefront. So Laura, I would love to turn it over to you. The Latino Climate Justice Framework covers a range of intersectional issues and acknowledges that the Latino community is not a monolith and that our issues are not monolithic. Issues like climate migration, immigration reform, language access, and issues plaguing Puerto Rico are not given the consideration that is needed to make sure that our communities see itself in the proposals and parts of the solution. How do you see issues like immigration reform and accessibility intersecting with climate justice? And is it important for decision makers to consider these issues when speaking about climate change and climate justice?
Thanks so much, Irene and Mark. And can we just give Irene a hand for being the driving force behind this amazing framework? It really is tremendous. So congratulations. And I'm honored, Hispanic Federation is honored to be a part of it. As for your question, as Sister Audre Lorde famously said, we do not lead single issue lives. Right? Climate justice is an issue that intersects all of the things that impact our communities and quality of life. For example, race and poverty are some of the strongest predictors of environmental degradation in communities. And with increasing frequency and intensity of extreme weather events, we know that community colors are on the front lines of environmental and the public health impacts of climate change. We are all here because we are committed to ensuring that climate solutions address these inequities and provide justice for these communities. Just as we saw with the Dust Bowl migration in the US in the 30s, climate-related migration is increasing because of food insecurity caused by environmental changes, climate-induced disruptions, including weather-related disasters, drought, famine, rising sea levels. The UN has predicted that by 2050, there may be as many as 200 million climate displaced persons. Climate-forced migrants and other environmental migrants face additional risks during their journey and after they arrive at their destination. Many are exposed to trauma, violence, and unhealthy conditions in their country of origin, along their migration journey, and in their new country of residence. Yet environmental migrants lack formal protections under US or international law. While the effects of climate change can aggravate societal tensions that lead to persecution in their home countries, many climate displaced persons do not yet meet the definitions of a refugee under international or domestic law, and that needs to change. The US needs to be an active leader in international discussions that would include designating global protections for climate forced and other environmental pressured migration. And there are things that the Biden administration can do, such as direct the State Department and USAID to create and implement a new humanitarian program for international migrants who've been displaced by environmental disasters or climate change. They should be collecting and maintaining and providing data on displacement caused by climate change. And there are a number of things that we can do in that area. And as I said, I think the US should be a leader in that work. But as the saying goes, we should think globally, but also we can act locally. We need to increase community involvement in decision-making processes, and that includes those in the immigrant communities, in our immigrant communities. Almost half of all Latinos in the US are ineligible to vote. Partly that's because we're such a young population, but just half of the total Latino immigrant population are eligible to vote. Those who are ineligible to vote are often left out of the policy-making process. Non-citizens are not welcomed into the policy process. And despite the fact that Spanish is the most common language, the most common non-English language in the US, Spanish is still too often a barrier to participation, services, and information. So we should think globally about these issues, but it is on us to act locally in our communities by creating processes and engagement that not only recognizes, but makes room for and lifts up leadership in all frontline impacted communities, and that includes immigrant communities.
Yeah, thank you for that. And as one of our advocates today in our meetings said, you know, we still have guidelines like the Citizens Guide to NEPA, and language like that needs to change. So thank you, Luis, for that advocacy point. And Mayra, so zooming in a little bit, you know, we know extreme heat is affecting our farm workers disproportionately. We also know that there's a tremendous issue with chemical exposure and pesticides. I wanted to zoom in a little specifically on that issue and safety for our workers, and what can we do, what advocacy can we elevate around pesticide safety, and what does that look like on the ground from an advocacy perspective? How can we come together as a community around that issue?
Yes, that's a very good question. And pesticides and climate are related, not just because the production of pesticides releases greenhouse gases, but as climate change intensifies, we expect that there will be more pests, more pesticide use, more exposure to workers. In addition to that, heat can make pesticide exposure worse in that people absorb more of it. So you get greater exposure and greater risk. What we would like to see is for EPA to get rid of a number of pesticide classes, such as the so-called organophosphate pesticides that are pesticides that we know are extremely toxic. They cause acute poisonings, chronic effects such as cancer, birth defects. We would like EPA also to ensure that there's better enforcement at the state level of the worker protection standard, which is the set of rules that's designed to protect farm workers from pesticide exposure. And we would like to make sure that EPA begins to promote safer alternatives in agriculture. They do that in other spheres, not so much for agriculture, where most of that exposure is happening. And we need them to take action on that right now because it's a big environmental justice issue.
Gracias. And Elizabeth, turning it over to you. And thanks for joining us. I know you have engagements. I appreciate your time. Recently, President Joe Biden signed the IRA, or the Inflation Reduction Act. While the IRA is poised to bring historic investments, we know a compromise is being potentially negotiated, as we call the dirty side deal, that would gut permitting reform. What can our community do to fight this? And can you speak to how the grassroots can hold our elected officials and agencies accountable to ensure they maximize the IRA's benefits to Latino communities?
Gracias, Irene, for that question. You know, we immediately at the Climate Justice Alliance moved to respond and to try to put pressure across the country because this legislation was just, you know, really harmful. It's, you know, just simply by allocating billions to unproven geoengineering projects, nuclear energy, green hydrogen, carbon markets, and by handcuffing investments to clean energy to new fossil fuel projects, this really threatens the well-being of our communities and really exacerbates the conditions of sacrifice zones. We will continue to be sacrifice zones. So obviously, my response would be that we have to continue to organize, and we need to continue to educate our elected officials about the impact that these kinds of pieces of legislation have on us. You know, in the state of New York, we uprose the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance and the EJ leadership in New York helped pass the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, and we serve on the Climate Action Council's Climate Justice Working Group. And that influenced Justice 40. I share that with you because that legislation, which is considered the most aggressive climate legislation in the country, is an example of what the grassroots can do. There you see a coalition of over 300 groups that created that and is working on the next leg of that legislation, which would be making sure that the investments exist for a green reindustrialization of our waterfronts and for the solutions that we need to be able to survive the impacts of climate change. So organizing from creating opportunities for popular education, engaging frontline communities in ways that is meaningful, making sure that there are investments in frontline communities like ours, where we are working on things like offshore wind, community-owned solar cooperatives, infrastructure. It isn't just that we are getting policy passed, it's also that we're putting infrastructure on the ground, and we're also building leadership. We are a leaderful, intergenerational, matriarchal movement. And so I share that with you, Irene, because I think that communities, Latino communities, are often put in a box, and organizations like ours are thought about in terms of doing community outreach, but they don't realize that we are the ones that are shaping policy and that we are literally operationalizing a just transition on the ground. The relationship that we have, the historical relationships that we have with our elected officials, make it possible for us to be able to move the money and make sure that there are investments in those kinds of projects that generate green jobs, good paying jobs for our community. So there is so much that we are doing, and we have been very successful, even in decommissioning peakers in New York, something that was unheard of, right? We're successful but the work doesn't end. It really has to be amplified. We need to be working with each other in deep solidarity. And we need to be able to share resources so that we can be really strategic to make sure that we don't let up on the kind of pressure that we're putting on our elected officials and what we expect from them. I also think that leadership is coming from the states, that we can't always depend on the federal government, as you know, because, this was a great opportunity for the Biden administration to declare a climate emergency, and they didn't, and he did not, his administration did not. And so we are sort of saddled with this legislation that harms our communities, makes it impossible to access the resources. We would only have 2 years to actually access these resources. And so a lot of the attention has to be hyper local and in the states that we live in. And it has to be consistent with place, right? The solutions in New York City or an industrial waterfront where I live and work are not going to be the same as they are in rural areas. But I have to say that it begins on the ground. It has to be intergenerational. It has to be leaderful. And we need to work better with each other to make sure that we're not working against cross purposes or at odds with each other. There is so much at stake right now. And we know from all of the recurring extreme weather events that we have been watching, whether it's the hurricane in Puerto Rico or Hurricane Ida, or all of the extreme weather events that we've been going through, that literally we are at that place, we have already pivoted. And so, but do we have power? Have we changed things? We're literally transforming the landscape, and we need to be able to get folks to invest in that kind of vision and that kind of ability to literally move people to not only create the kind of legislation that will protect and put our people out of harm's way, but make it possible for our communities to thrive in the midst of all of it. I can't hear you. Oh my God.
Gracias.
Oh, okay.
And Laura, question for you, related something Elizabeth also touched on. Hurricane Fiona hit Puerto Rico last month, 5 years after Hurricane Maria, a Category 4 hurricane, plagued by historic disinvestment and colonial status, and Puerto Rico's infrastructure has struggled to recover. Luma, Puerto Rico's private energy company, has only made matters worse, and so far has seemed to only increase utility bills and fail at bringing the people of Puerto Rico reliable power. How can Puerto Rican self-determination aid in mitigating climate risk and building climate resilience for the island? And what is the role of communities during these critical times?
Don't get me started on Luma. Among other things, Hispanic Federation engages in significant disaster relief programs in Puerto Rico, where for the past 5 years, we have become one of the largest private funders of projects to catalyze long-term resilient recovery driven by empowered communities. And one of the reasons we've had to step into that role is because the official processes and government is not doing that. They have not, under the last administration, they actively worked to prevent recovery of Puerto Rico. As far as, self-determination, we believe that all people have the right to freely choose their sovereignty and international political status with no interference. And the president and Congress need to work with Puerto Ricans to develop and fund a federally binding, democratic self-determination process that includes effective education to voters about each option to move the island towards decolonization and guarantees that the will of the people is respected and implemented. But in the meantime, there needs to be a return to self-governance. In a democracy, policy decisions that impact people's lives should be made by elected representatives. A return to democratic self-governance requires that ultimate authority on all fiscal and financial decisions on the island must be returned to its elected representatives. Congress must terminate promesa, eliminate the unelected FOMB. But regardless of who is in control, we need to insist on processes that protect human and environmental rights. Rebuilding should not be an excuse for exploitation or for waiving any civil, human, or environmental rights in the name of speed or greed. And we are seeing that happening. Debt relief should not come before people. A just recovery isn't possible when those in power prioritize paying creditors instead of investing in the recovery and future of Puerto Rico. And a sustainable and just recovery must focus on long-term solutions. Recovery efforts must meet the needs of the present communities without compromising future generations by taking a holistic approach, achieving a balance between economic, social, and environmental development. But most importantly, a just recovery needs to be led by the communities who know their needs best.
Gracias. And just looking at time and rounding out the question, I wanted to close this out and then open it up to the panel. But just the final question, and you can just give a quick sentence response. Why do you think the LCJF, or the Latino Climate Justice Framework, is important for our communities, and how can it support the work that you and your organization is doing? Maida, if you want to go ahead and take that.
So it's important because it's a roadmap for all of us, and what it proposes is rooted in solutions that come from the communities that are affected. So I would like to thank Green Latinos for their leadership in bringing so many groups together to create this important framework. So thank you.
Well, we are at, I mean, the word historic gets thrown around a lot, but man, is there a lot of money out there. I mean, at levels that we have never seen before. It's not enough, but it is the most we've ever seen that is being dedicated to, you know, trying to solve some of these problems. But having these large pots of money or of funding is it's valuable, it's overdue, but it's also how it's deployed, right? And how we can use it that will really ultimately determine resilience for our communities. Having this framework, as Mayra said, provides a roadmap for where we should be insisting and how we should be advocating for our communities and for these monies to make a difference.
Gracias.
Can I respond?
And Elizabeth, to close
Yeah.
us out.
Thank you. Just a few things. I just want to flag that it's great to hear that others are using the framework of a just recovery that was created by the climate justice movement and really by the people in Texas after Hurricane Andrew, and that is being used all over. Second, in terms of the word resiliency, I just want to say that word means bouncing back, which is something that we could never do. We can never go back, because to go back means to go back to extraction, to discrimination, to all the things that got us to where we are right now. So we always use the term social cohesion. And I really want to applaud Green Latinos, because we can't launch anything if it isn't centered on racial justice and equity. And we need to be able to use the kind of language and the kinds of principles that really sort of put us aligned with all of the formations that are coming, that are from people of African and indigenous ancestry, that are the ones that are going to be impacted and are being the most impacted by climate change. So this, for me, is this report and this work that's being done by Green Latinos is an example of how we're going to be writing together to make sure that we're looking out for all our peoples everywhere in the United States and beyond, and that we are aligned with each other in ways that are fundamentally principled and centered on racial justice and equity. I am just really proud to be here today and to be joining you. We've just come such a long way. And I think that this kind of alignment and solidarity is what this moment absolutely needs. So, de corazón, gracias. And I'm just really happy to be in this space with all of you.
Thank you. Yeah, big hand of applause. And we have a couple minutes just for some questions. So if you want to raise your hand, and I don't know if we can bring around a mic. Any questions for speakers? I see one back here.
Two big questions that could be their own panels, but I'll try to keep it short. Francisco Alvarez, I work with a clean energy company. First question is, I appreciate that you alluded to the issue of climate displacement and climate refugees. I agree, they're not adequately addressed in international law. But I also think about First Nations and First Peoples, who they are living on, for whatever way you'd like to define it, their ancestral lands, and they are facing in real time climate impacts. That the soil is degrading underneath them, their lands are being washed away to the sea. Where do they go? Can they become internally displaced people within the US? What other options do they have? What kind of federal funding is being put out there to support these communities to stay on their lands? And the other question is, can you provide an example where a public-private partnership or a partnership between a community and a private entity has worked to advance EJ outcomes? Thank you.
Well, the allusion to the Dust Bowl, I guess, was an example of IDPs, internally displaced persons, right? That isn't anything new. In addition to the things that you talked about, we now have farmers on historic and ancestral land being denied access to water, right? Because it's being diverted to large farms, to green lawns in Las Vegas, so it's a huge problem. I mean, and in Puerto Rico, I was just on a call today with my colleagues in Puerto Rico, and she was saying, we don't want to leave our island, right? We want to raise our kids here, but how can we if we don't have clean water, if we don't have electricity, if we don't have, so, I think that is hopefully the point of what we're doing is to make sure that money goes to our communities, right? And is deployed for our communities, for ancestral communities, indigenous communities, all of our communities, so that they can stay and thrive where they choose to, where the choice of where they live and raise their children isn't taken out of their hands because the environmental degradation has become so bad. So it's up to us to fight for those, and especially to fight for the most vulnerable communities whose voices are not heard in these discussions.
Okay, thank you. And Elizabeth, did you? have a
I just wanted to say there are 4 things we need. We need renewable energy, water, food sovereignty, and wellness. And the pushing people out, as we saw in the Gulf South, with people who came out of Katrina in New Orleans and what's happening in Puerto Rico, and then using the same land that we've been pushed out of for speculators is what everyone calls disaster capitalism. So we need to be really careful with that, because right now, city municipal governments are talking about managed retreat. And what that means of people, indigenous people, means really being moved away from their ancestral land forever and not having access to water, not having access to the basic things, as was just said before. And these are policies that are bubbling up, and they're not being called what they are, but they really are about extraction, not just of our lands, but literally of our bodies, of moving us out. So it's a really good question, and it's one that we're all struggling with right now. What does it mean for our communities when there are recurrent extreme weather events that are becoming more and more severe, for us to be able to thrive in the land that we are connected with? It's a big issue, and it's a really important one for us to galvanize around.
And if I could just add one more thing, it's not just the environmental degradation and the droughts, it's also policies that are pushing people from their lands. For example, in Puerto Rico, we have people who still have not received money to rebuild their homes adequately following Maria, 5 years. After 5 years of living in a home that is substandard, if FEMA offers you money to move, is that really a choice? Right? You're not given the choice to stay. You're told, well, we're not going to help you stay, but here's some money to help you move. And guess what happens to that land afterwards? It's available to speculators. It's available to private companies. So it's not just the environmental impacts. It's also policies that are forcing people, from their ancestral lands and disrupting historic communities. You know, these low income people, and sorry, I talk about Puerto Rico a lot because that's what I know the most, but there are historic communities, people who are disabled, people who are vulnerable, people who are seniors, who rely on their communities, right, to provide support for them, to look out for them. And so it's not just that individual that's being displaced, it's whole communities that are being disrupted. And we need to speak out against policies that are enabling this.
Yeah, and just to uplift, Elizabeth also added that FEMA is actually displacing frontline communities and
Mhm.
contributing to that diaspora. Do we have another question right here?
Yeah, my question is to all three panelists. With this document, what is your best vision for how members of Congress and members of the Congressional Hispanic Caucus specifically can use this new framework to impact policy, but also more importantly, to work collaboratively with community the way that Elizabeth has described in terms of letting frontline communities lead the conversation?
Do you want to, Maida, do you have some thoughts?
Yes, good question. I think that the framework provides as much of a roadmap for them as it does for us. The solutions are out there. The communities are proposing the solutions. Now it's up to the policymakers to listen. And I think that it's incumbent on the federal government, state and local governments to really take a hard look at all the different environmental and economic policies that they have been implementing. And if they are really listening to the communities, they will take a look at this framework and see where are we falling short? How do we get to that goal? I think it's very important that, that policy is centered around the needs of the people and the communities of color and the poor communities that have been bearing the impacts of climate change. For the most part, they weren't the ones who created the problem. It was people with more money, more access, more privilege that created most of this problem. So let's not put the burden on them to do all the work to solve the problem. Policymakers and the rest of us who have the ability to do so, to craft those policies to help bring about change.
And I would just say briefly, what members of Congress need to do is value the voices of impacted communities just as much as they value the voices of traditional green groups when they are creating policies.
Elizabeth, do you have anything to add?
Sure, that was, that was perfect, but clearly they need to recognize the complexity and sophistication of ancestral knowledge, and that this is a manifestation of that this just shows that we understand our communities, we know what the solutions are, we have a history of making a difference, and that we are growing in numbers, and that we are united, and that we are walking in our power. And if they don't honor and respect that, they can't continue in office. And so I think this is a roadmap that really tells the story of our resistance in all its complexity. So yeah, that's what I would say.
And if I just may add to that too, I would say that creating opportunities and forums for us to be able to have those pathways of communication open with congressional offices is so critical and so important, because a lot of times we produce great content and reports like this, and it's almost just a barrier to get the information out into the right hands or create that conversational opportunity to be able to highlight our needs and our problems. And so I would just say, yeah, creating more of those opportunities, those forums and those dialogues. Yeah.
Which I really want to recognize and acknowledge that Chairman Grijalva has done that.
Yeah.
By creating the Environmental Justice for All Act, by always having doors open to EJ communities, and by having staff here from the office tonight.
Yeah.
So some offices are doing this much better than others.
I completely agree. Or even gathering us advocates to discuss like, how do we talk about the dirty side deal and the permitting, and opportunities like that are so incredibly helpful. Okay, I think we have time for like one more question, maybe. Yeah. Yeah.
Oh,
I don't
someone
know.
here?
Well, you have a question. Go ahead and ask. Yeah, go ahead.
So my question, you're talking about a historic amount of money that's coming in, and the goods, the natural goods that get made into asphalt, concrete, all of the raw materials, that's impacting Native communities, it's impacting rural Latinos. The concrete asphalt facilities, they're all located in our community. I think there needs to be, I'm asking if how can we better discuss the conversation that if we're supercharging infrastructure, it doesn't necessarily equal justice if the enforcement's not taking place on the front end. And then the other part that I'm kind of curious about is I really see this as a financial literacy opportunity. We want to see these projects built by and for our community, being prime contractors, getting access to those resources, also doing the architecting and the engineering, right? Like, I think that there's a lot of layers to how this money can come back into our communities. I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about that.
Well, to your second point, I mean, I hope that that's one of the impacts that we see from the Justice 40 initiative, right? It's not just that our communities benefit from this in terms of the infrastructure and the impacts, but that our architects, that our engineers, that our, people that come from these communities also are employed to do that work. So it's up to us to make sure that Justice 40 is implemented and hold President Biden and his agencies to that promise. I don't know anything about asphalt. Sorry.
So if I may, what we know in response to the brother's question is that extreme weather events are also going to disrupt the supply chain. And so we, in our community, what we're looking at is an industrial waterfront that historically has been responsible for toxic harm in our lungs, in our bodies. I've lost family, all of us, right? The same way that, the Barras family can talk about what's happened in Houston, the same thing in Brooklyn. And so what we're talking about is a green reindustrialization. We're talking about how we take the industrial sector and make it pivot so that it's working on climate adaptation, mitigation, and resilience. And so we're talking about thousands of jobs. That's what we did when we fought Industry City for 7 years in Sunset Park. And then we were able to see $500 million of investments in offshore wind that would benefit the region, but also benefit the local community by making sure that we're not displaced, that we retain residential and economic social cohesion in our community. So we are looking at infrastructure. Justice 40 sadly focuses on benefits when if it really wanted to copy the CLCPA in the state of New York, should have been focusing on investment. So there are some problems with that there. But, fortunately, we also have access to the Department of Energy, the White House Council on Environmental Quality, and we're trying to make sure that they pivot in a direction where they are investing in local communities. And investment isn't just about rhetoric. It is about infrastructure. It is about what we just did by launching the first community-owned solar cooperative and creating local wealth so that our communities actually own the utilities. These are things that we're doing, looking at making sure that offshore wind right now, for example, all the parts come from Europe. How do we make sure that the parts are being built here and that supply chain, as you mentioned, is honoring what we call a just transition? All of this has to be centered on a just transition, which means that even the process can be toxic and can't harm the host community. And so it is complicated, but I think that it's doable, and many of us are already doing that kind of work. And what we're thinking is that we need to create pilot replicable projects that really address coastal, mountaintop, rural, urban, all of the different kinds of communities that are going to be impacted. Capture that knowledge, the learnings, even the mistakes, so that we can share that widely, so that communities that don't have access to these resources can just sort of jump. having that knowledge and just hit the ground running. That's why we have to be leaderful, because we need to be able to share expertise on how we push policy, how we invest in infrastructure, what financing models look like for community-owned solar. It's all really complicated, but it's happening literally all over the country. And so these big pieces of legislation can help amplify that and make sure that we create those pilot projects.
Okay. Well, I just want to thank our amazing set of panelists. So please give them one last round of applause. And I just want to uplift, if you haven't, you grabbed an LCJF report, go to the front, and after this, we have right here, Laura showing, in the second page, there's a QR code. You can go to our website, lcjf.greenlatinos.org. 2 actions: share it with your colleagues, your partners, your lists, your social media, your congressional members. And second, endorse it so you can become a signatory online. So thank you all so much. I really appreciate it.
Yeah.
Gracias, Elizabeth. We appreciate everything.
Thank
Buenas
you.
noches.
Good night.
Okay,
Peace.
good night.